in the future. And sort of just to set the tone of what we will talk about, I wanted to say at least 3 markets that we're very familiar with: the US, the EU, and the UK, some sort of policies that have been put in place to back the development of CCUS. In the US, for example, specifically CDR, there's been nearly $4 billion in Q4 of last year to back various forms of CDR. But CCS, as well as CCU, has benefited from the IRS's improvement to Section 45Q, which has been mentioned several times today. And in the EU, you have everything from the Green New Deal to the climate law. Just 2 months ago, they've released $100 million for the development of CCUS and hubs. They have a hub strategy as well in Europe. Since 2009, they've more or less been focusing on CCUS. And then in the UK, which announced, I think, in Q1 or in Q4 of last year, £20 billion to support their roadmap. I'm sure my colleagues here seated will know more intimately about those details. I just wanted to provide a few broad strokes. And then refer to CDR, but I don't want anyone to see this as too far afield. There is a lot of overlap as we will get into the discussion about infrastructure, as well as verification and validation of the credits. And so there is a lot of overlap, and you will need the sort of CCS and CCU infrastructure to enable a more robust and scalable CDR landscape. So these are some of the technologies I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If not, please, you're free to speak with me after. There are quite a few of carbon to value and CDR folks here. And that's the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to ask after. And I will now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Paul Zakkour, who is based in Frankfurt, Germany, also based in Germany. Paul is well known for his seminal work on the design and integration of carbon geostorage into EU and UN policy and carbon pricing mechanisms more than a decade ago. His more recent work is focused on the policy environment for negative emissions, carbon removals, beneficial uses of CO2, and the treatment of sink enhancements under the Paris Agreement. Paul has also broad experience in climate policy across Europe, Asia, North America, the Middle East, and Africa, including design and implementation of carbon pricing programs, nationally determined contributions, and long-term low-emission development strategies. Paul has been a consulting director at Carbon Counts for more than 14 years, a decade and a half nearly, and prior to which he spent over 6 years as a principal consultant at ERM, which many of us here know, me at least, and their energy and climate practice. He holds a PhD in environmental technology from Imperial, which all of us should also know, and lives in Germany, in Frankfurt am Main. So, without further ado, please, Paul, come take the mic.
Thanks very much, James, for that very well delivered introduction. Very nice. I've forgotten about some of the things in there, but so yeah, I've been asked today to talk about really the interaction between regulatory frameworks and the carbon markets, and this is particularly germane to the topic of CCUS, but actually any climate solution where we have to enhance a terrestrial carbon sink, be it the ocean, be it biogenic sinks or geological sinks, because this means we have to ensure that the CO2 stays in that storage zone for a period of time that's meaningful to the mitigation of climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey ahead, where we need to go to, but also where we've come from, and then hopefully that's going to give us a bit of a sense of what we need to do today to get our act together in terms of understanding the regulatory frameworks that we need to operate within, and how those regulatory frameworks, what they can draw from, but also what they should be looking to do to help us to accelerate the deployment of carbon storage technologies. I'll do the obligatory slide about us. This is just a snapshot of some of the work that we've done over the last 14 years, over 120 projects across 35 different countries with a whole range of different customers and clients, public and private sector. And as you can see, we work across Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, North Africa, and Asia Pacific, as well as in the European market. So we have a very wide breadth and depth of experience across the different areas, and hopefully we'll be able to bring that all to one place today to share with you on the particular topic of CCUS. Just to say, the way ahead indicates the need for an urgent scale-up of CCUS. Here we see the IEA's CCS net zero roadmap from 2021. As you can see, we've got in the region of over 7 gigatons, it's about 7.2 gigatons, I think they have, of stored carbon in 2050. This is coming from a variety of sources, fossil, biogenic, and direct air capture. But what we can see there is to get to net zero, we're going to have to enhance a lot of geological carbon sinks. We're going to have to do it very quickly from where we are today. And that's going to need to encompass these technical carbon dioxide removal solutions. If we look at what the IPCC is saying, we're in the ballpark of 2 to 3 gigatons of biogenic and direct air capture CO2 that's being used to offset ongoing residual CO2 emissions in other parts of the economy, what the previous session talked about. But I think we also need to wake up to the fact that more countries need to engage in CCUS. This is a quick sort of snapshot of where we are with countries that mention CCS within their nationally determined contributions, which are the key documents road mapping where countries are going to go with their carbon mitigation plans to 2030. As you can see, the center is very much centered on the oil-producing countries that are mentioning CCUS. There's only 18 from 143 NDCs include explicit reference to CCUS. This is very low compared to things like forestry or renewable energy or other things. When we look at the long-term low-emission development strategies, which a country plans to 2050, we see there's a slightly higher mention of CCS, 39 from 53 published so far. But I mean, I think the challenge we see is countries need to engage here. We need parties involved in this discussion under the UN framework to move things forward. When we look at the carbon market, I borrowed this from the Task Force Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets report from 2021. This is some of the analysis in there that was done in the background of that paper. We actually see only 2.2 gigatons of CCUS, so 200,000 tons, being delivered by the voluntary carbon market, mainly from current inventory. This is how it's pitched in that report. And it's this circle here. We see 1 to 3.5 gigatons of technology-based removals, but that's quite optimistic compared to only 200,000 tons of CCUS. And this is probably, could be a very challenging to deliver CCS through the current carbon market. I'm talking about fossil point source CCS because it's not really that attractive for buyers who want to buy removals or for buyers who just want to buy cheap credits. CCUS is somehow falling through the cracks. So we might end up doing a lot of BECCS and DACs and a lot of red, but we might not end up doing any point source fossil CO2 capture under the carbon markets. So I think we need to think about how that's going to work. Actually, what we see here, I think avoided nature loss is actually a euphemism in this study for avoided deforestation. And nature-based sequestration is something, not quite sure what that encompasses, more like soil carbon and improved forest management. And standard setters need to catch up. This is a snapshot from the World Bank State and Trends in Carbon Market. This is from 2021 report. They've probably updated it since then, so I apologize for the vintage here. But the point is that there's only 3 standards listed in there that are dealing with geological storage of carbon. That's the American Carbon Registry, the Alberta Offset Program, and the Clean Development Mechanism. Nobody else has got a standard. So Gold Standard just published a new one last week or 2 weeks ago on bio-CCS, and GCC, as we heard earlier, are also working on a method, and Vera is working on another one. But at the minute, there's only 3 in existence compared to all these other methodologies for lots of other different types of solutions. So there's some more work to do on the standard setting. So that's the journey ahead. But if we backcast a little bit, we already had a very long journey starting in 2005 on how CCS was included under the Clean Development Mechanism. As you can see here, the point of this slide is not to give you chapter and verse on every single decision and text that was produced in pursuit of this outcome, but the point is that there was a lot of it It was a lot of discussions, a lot of negotiations, a lot of process, but not just process, a lot of content, a lot of substantive materials were put together. And it was only at the end of 2011 there, the red text, that we actually got an agreement on the rule book, on the standards for CCS under the UN carbon crediting framework. And this has really set a de facto baseline of what we need to do today in designing new standards for any kind of removals or sink enhancement activities and particularly geological sink enhancements. And I guess the point here is we should avoid not learning from these lessons. We've had a 10-year hiatus, and a lot of this being forgotten, but it's still actually relevant to today's discussions. So the main concerns why it took so long was this whole risk of impermanence and the risk of carbon reversal. And this, I always use this diagram, sorry the animation's messed up a bit here, but it's supposed to show you that we have this whole bunch of stuff on the left, which is all the local environmental health and safety issues that need to be dealt with when you're storing carbon, so the risk of surface release, the risk to local populations or whatever. But also we have this global concern, this international issue on the right, which was much more about, should say, UNFCCC in Paris, I think now. This is how old this slide deck is, because I borrowed it from an older one. But of course, the same problem is there, that if the CO2 leaks back to the atmosphere, it's not doing the job it's supposed to do in pursuit of the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement. So, but of course, the two are closely related. So this is where the regulatory piece comes in. If a local regulator is able to deal with these local regulatory issues, then it should take care of actually of the international risks as well. So this is why when we're developing CCS projects and standards, we often see them referring to local laws and regulations, because they're actually really important to make sure that local regulators are ready to cope with all these potential issues and risks and to manage them accordingly. So I think on that note, really just to say a little bit of work that's going on, these are some of the existing standards that are out there and some of the key methodological issues or components within them. As you can see, Puro Earth's also got a standard, CCS Plus is working on something, the ones I mentioned earlier. And I just want to mention, this was some work that was done last year under the umbrella of IETA. IETA is a 300-plus member organization from the carbon markets. And the whole point of this was to capture the start point for how we're going to do CCS under new mechanisms. And I won't read all this out, but the key thing to take away on the right side is the safeguards, and these are really much about the regulatory issues. Is it politically accepted? Are there legal and regulatory requirements in place to cope with the risks of storing carbon, and has it been fully risk assessed? And so what we did in that piece of work was come up with a very quick summary of 6 key methodological areas and 10-point safeguards areas, and they're all written up and available on the IETA website, but I won't go through them now. But you can see on the right side of this slide is really the key regulatory piece that needs to come with any project involving CCUS and carbon markets. We need that regulatory piece and the safeguards in place. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Great presentation. Many questions, actually, and follow-up, so looking forward to our discussion. Right, so after Paul comes Travis. Right, Travis's brief biography, as he started his career less than half a decade ago. He's in product development at Evident out of the UK. He's responsible for developing registries to certify the clean economy. He unites a lot of us here on this panel. He oversaw the development of registries for renewables and low methane natural gas before co-founding the carbon removal standard CCUS. Before starting his career, Travis graduated from UCL, University College London, with a degree in geography. Travis, would you like to come up and take the stage? Or take the podium?
Okay, perfect. Hello, me again. Brilliant. So, yeah, the title obviously speaks for itself. CCUS deployment roadmap. With any roadmap, you need to be able to track, monitor, verify, and certify progress towards actually meeting targets that are set. I'm going to be talking about the standards perspective from Evident. And Paul hinted at the need for new standards, or at least for existing standards to catch up. Hopefully, I will be able to present a path forward that is attractive. So a bit of background on who Evident is. We're a world leader in certifying the clean economy. Our background is actually renewable energy certification. So we developed the IREC market. For those that are unfamiliar, an IREC is an alternative instrument to certifying renewable energy projects. So instead of issuing against a counterfactual baseline of avoided emissions, we just issue the fact, the megawatt hour, that then becomes a tradable instrument for end users to claim renewable energy consumption. We started this in 2014, and it's now grown exponentially to being issued in over 50 countries around the world outside the EU and the US. And when I joined Evident 3 years ago, we recognized that we could apply the same principles for tracking, certifying, and developing markets to other environmental asset classes. And that's when we developed MIQ with our partners at the Rocky Mountain Institute and Systemic to certify natural gas and actually be able to grade natural gas based on its methane intensity. Hopefully these numbers speak for themselves. Why is certification important? I've already touched on it, but essentially, today and tomorrow towards 2040 or 2050, whatever roadmap you use, claims need to be underpinned by robust third-party verified evidence. And that's where we come in as a registry provider to ensure and to facilitate that, there's issuance, there's transfer, and there's unique redemption claims associated with the clean economy, so that claims can be underpinned by robust evidence and ensure that there's no double counting. Certification also allows for the generation of primary and/or additional revenue streams, which is great for project developers in terms of financing. Our role really is to empower industry, consumers, and governments to buy clean. So this is where I like to talk about the product multiverse. Our background is certifying electricity and low methane natural gas. But as I mentioned, we want to diversify our registry portfolio and serve any environmental asset class within the clean economy and provide that centralized registry. Our vision, as stated on the screen, is that all claims within the global clean economy, from materials to energy, are independently certified, and we would like that to happen through our registry. And so we're looking at developing registries for all of these different asset classes on the slide deck. If you're developing one of these solutions, please feel free to talk to me afterwards about your tracking and certification requirements. And this is, I'll just touch upon quite a unique point that we offer over existing carbon market standards. What we're actually developing is interoperability between different asset classes. So as you've heard today, CCUS, CDR, there's a lot of inputs that go into that process, whether it's electricity, natural gas, point source capture. We are developing market instruments to certify all of those asset classes. And we do this working towards a globally recognized standard for attribute tracking. Evident is accredited to the International Attribute Tracking Standard, which is managed by an independent not-for-profit based in the Netherlands, and it's recognized by CDP and the GHG protocol as a reliable and credible backbone for attribute tracking. In terms of carbon management, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking to develop solutions to certify both CCUS and CDR. And that's because carbon management will form part of a collection of environmental assets that form part of this growing ecosystem. And a lot of technologies will require CCUS or CDR certificates to actually negate the residual impact. And that's where we come in to develop these markets. First to market was C-Capsule, so we co-founded a new standard to certify carbon dioxide removal, durable carbon dioxide removal, Lots more acronyms on the slide. You've already heard loads today, but essentially we want to support direct air capture, bioenergy capture with carbon storage, enhanced rock weathering, and biomass carbon removal and storage. And ultimately, we're developing markets for both the voluntary and compliance space. This is particularly important for carbon management methods because of their high cost. They will not likely scale in the voluntary carbon market. We need compliance mechanisms like CBAM and ETS and Article 6 to actually drive scale. And that's the end of my slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Travis. Next up, we have Nathan. Nathan has 2.5 decades of experience in the process industries. His corporate experience includes mainly engineering management and decarbonization technology deployment. And his management experience includes location-based and project-specific engineering. He's a decarbonization subject matter expert and is based here in the Middle East, in the MENA region, here with deep knowledge of CCUS techniques, energy efficiency methods, emissions abatement, and most strongly, the production of new energy via blue and green technology routes. He's a true global consultant, having executed most of his projects in Southeast Asia, and he's originally from Australia, as we've discussed prior, the Pacific and the GCC, so the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, as well as in North America. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Nathan.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for everyone's time this afternoon. Unlike some of my colleagues, I'm not a specialist in regulation. I do want to speak to road mapping and how to unlock some of that technology-based carbon capture that Paul so well spoke to earlier. I'm going to look at typical cost build-up depending on the source and the nature of the CO2. The roadblocks that we are currently seeing to execution of some of these projects, taking it from sort of some very interesting study work through FID into EPC and execution startup. The sort of stimuli that could be applied to the technology sector and how to unlock the potential of both the technology and supply chain to capture CO2. And then I'm just going to do a fanciful crystal balling of in what order some of that stimulus could take place. This is just a typical abatement curve that we've seen many examples of today so far, but it's just pointing out that the cost of capture from a technology base can be highly varying depending on the source. Yes, the obvious differences between the source might be the concentration of CO2. Other elements might consider the operating pressure of the point source, the temperature of the point source, the availability of waste heat in the neighbouring plant to harvest so that a parasitic load's not necessary to capture the CO2. And this all builds up to cost base that could be anywhere between, say, $40 a tonne to $200 a tonne, varying from, say, pre-combustion sources, generally at the lower side of the scale, to post-combustion sources, from, say, somewhere like a combined cycle gas turbine power plant. Historically, we've seen a pretty low value put on carbon regionally and often thought of as a medium for enhanced oil recovery. I think we'll start to see a shift in that dialogue going, yes, EOR is important and can set up a lot of the technology base and the infrastructure base, but we'll start to see more and more of that discussion turn to sequestration of carbon rather than the use of CO2 for EOR. Just to further hammer home the point, when someone talks about the cost of capture and the cost of CCUS, we really need to be looking to the source that we're talking about and the sort of economic framework that we're talking to. Even the cost of capital that we are assuming for the deployment of some of these projects can have quite a significant difference in the overall economics of the venture. Yes, there's different technologies that can be applied to carbon capture, but generally we're seeing chemical solvent applied to most use cases and the most economic for pre- and post-combustion sources. Roadblocks. We've heard the word collaboration quite a lot today already. I'm not going to reiterate that other than to say that economies of scale on common infrastructure like CO2 compression, transport, dehydration can make an immense reduction to the overall unitized cost of capture and deployment. So that collaboration and the use of industrial hubs can really reduce the unitized cost of the endeavor. Utilization, typically recognized forms of CO2 utilization is typically less than 10% of the overall greenhouse gas source that we're seeing from industry at the moment. There are some profitable utilization pathways, but we need to recognize that given the utilization count is approximately 20% or so of total greenhouse gas emissions, that sequestration is going to be a large part of the discussion going forward. So then to that point, understanding transport costs and the geographical hurdle between point source location and the geographical asset, and the fact that the cost of transport is not to be forgotten about and can really lead to the sequencing of projects and the road mapping of projects, the obvious decision being pick up some rich sources of CO2 that are in close proximity to the sequestration sites. And then lastly, execution methodology. If we see teams of engineers doing bespoke engineering for each opportunity, then we're in a lot of trouble. This is a time for replicated design and product deployment rather than projects and high-end engineering. So what does it take to get CCUS out of the shell? So we can see forms of stimulus taking on, I quickly thought of 4 different forms. We could see cross-border taxation where we're seeing local energy producers needing to decarbonise their production sequence to profitably enter overseas markets. And we're seeing examples of cross-border taxes in Europe. Maybe it's a question of when that might extend to some common energy mediums being produced out of the Middle East. The need to future-proof that production with a low carbon count is obvious to enter those markets and avoid a harsh penalty on cross-border taxes. We're seeing the Inflation Reduction Act start to stimulate project activity in North America, effectively a production subsidy via a tax rebate. The third one's interesting. Has the market of energy offtake really appreciated and monetized the cost of low carbon energy, and what sort of price premium has been put on carbon intensity to energy offtake? We're seeing a lack of clarity on the price premium that's being afforded by the market. We're also seeing that the offtake agreements are generally in a shorter duration rather than what we're seeing to traditional energy forms. And then lastly, a little bit more nebulous, we're seeing record profits being announced by a lot of energy producers of late. There might be an argument for a social license to operate where we see some of these record profits be reinvested into decarbonisation of the asset. So just a little bit of crystal balling. What does it take to really see the trend that we're seeing already through regulations and economic stimulus in North America and Europe, and generally showing up as project heat maps? Probably cross-border taxes might come first. Potential production subsidies and corporate tax rebates, social license to operate and the need to reinvest record profits, and then possibly a recognition of the worth of low carbon energy streams lagging rather than being at the forefront of the stimulus. We're seeing a lot of uncertainty in that area with respect to, say, blue energy production, and I can't expect it to turn around too quickly just yet. So it's just a little bit of crystal balling, no wrong or right to that answer, just what some of the indicators are from the market that I'm playing in. So that's it. Thank you.
Just a word to the rear, I would like to go back to his penultimate or his ultimate slide when we get to just a bit of discussion, if there's time at the end, because that's a really good jumping off point. And good that he also mentioned collaboration. As you remember, that was my first slide. Enhanced carbon collaboration. There needs to be more of it. Let me introduce our penultimate speaker, Clayton, Mr. Clayton, Carl. He is an AD at the Boston Consulting Group in their Energy and Climate Practice, Associate Director, Associate Director, however, based in the UK as well, and his practice is focused primarily on supporting clients' strategic transformation within the energy transition and global decarbonization. Carl has deep expertise in low carbon solutions, covering CCS, bioenergy, biofuels, carbon removal, and hydrogen, as well as derivatives. Since joining BCG, Carl has worked extensively advising clients on large cross-border climate and energy-related transformations, including several corporations, energy companies, and PE and financial institutions. Prior to moving into consulting, he was 16 years in industry, in various engineering, management, and strategic development positions. He is also a chartered engineer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carl to the podium.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. The end is almost in sight. I'm sure there's been a lot of PowerPoint today, but hopefully it's been a good day for everyone. So all I want to try and do here, quite briefly, is just give a little bit of a 101 on the roadmap, how the outlook looks globally, and a few of the kind of like the critical enablers that have made impact already, but the few areas that we still need to see some resolutions kind of outside of the countries that are really deploying. So a bit of a shameless plug around some of BCG's thought leadership in the space. So I think 2019 and some of the material that you saw earlier kind of showed a bit of a lull in activity in the last decade, but 2019 was where we saw a real re-stimulus of CCS. Lots of NDC commitments, including carbon capture, lots of noise at COP, and pretty much there's a need to then establish what the business case is. How are we economically going to do this? You know, we need technology, we need utilization, we need shared infrastructure, we need to stimulate the market. One of the things that BCG did back in 2020 in collaboration with the OGCI was build out a global data set for where you can theoretically install carbon capture hubs. So, you know, high density of emissions, high concentration CO2, you know, hard to abate industries adjacently, locally to subsurface potential for storage. And then more recently, we've been looking at, you know, as the projects are moving closer and further along their development timeline, how do we finance these things? What is stopping capital coming into the market? And fundamentally, what is the cost going to be? And we do see that the costs are going to come down over time, mainly on the capital side rather than the operational side, without, you know, significant technology breakthroughs. But fundamentally, you know, the cost of CCS, if there is some global price flooring applied to it, and, you know, a value applied to lower carbon products and services, the cost is not as big as we think. So, quintessentially, you know, the enablers for what needs to be in place to stimulate CCS, and it's a public-private relationship. There is obviously a need for financial incentives, whether that be a price on carbon, you know, a lower technology cost, shared infrastructure, permitting, regulation. We've heard a lot about standards, things like land access, who takes liability for pore space, you know, can we transport CO2 across borders, a bunch of things that are kind of really all need to be there before companies are able to kind of hit go with financial investment decisions in this type of technology. Policy and regulation is emerging globally at different paces with different methods. But what you can see here is that we have a number of, let's call them quite highly supportive environments where CCS is going forward and they have carbon tax schemes, carbon pricing schemes, business models and contracts for differences, that type of thing that are supporting the sector. And then there's a lot of emerging and what we call lagging deployment. Lagging meaning they have everything there to get going, but they just need a little bit more activity. And as you can see, lots of red dots on that page. And that's basically showing that all of the incentives that are available in that country, both taxation, grants, accumulate to less than a $50 per ton overarching price. In fact, if we were to split that red in half, you'd find that quite a lot of it is less than 10. But outside of typical R&D spending, typical kind of like low-level investment in feed studies, we don't quite have the physical and financial incentives that are really needed to kick the sector on. One thing that has really kicked the sector on over the last few years is the concept of geographical hubs. So I think we touched on it a little bit there about, you know, a dense group of emitters, shared infrastructure, and this can be between anything from direct air capture to natural gas processing. But fundamentally, we need steelwork, we need subsurface, we need wells, we need to be able to soot all the CO2. This is a natural cost reduction methodology. Every ton is cheaper by economies of scale. But it's also helpful when you're going into bat against governments and policymakers when you have more than one voice at the table, more than one sector at the table, more than one, you know, user of this infrastructure and ability to carry things forward. And I think, you know, we've heard a lot about carbon dioxide removal from the panel already. Without this infrastructure, some of those techniques can't go forward in the same way that we need them to. CCS hubs exist globally, and what we did as part of the work a few years ago is look at, you know, where do we have a supporting CCS environment, i.e. they are, you know, it's named in NDC, it's, you know, they have some form of regulation, there's something stimulating the sector to be discussed. And globally, there is, you know, close to a gigaton of aggregated CCS hubs that would have an average price of less than $100 per ton. Aggregated across things like ammonia, gas processing, cement, and power in certain environments. But fundamentally, you know, there is a need for organizations to work together here in order to stimulate more and more activity. You know, 2030 is not that far away. We keep talking about gigaton of available projects by then. 7 years is absolutely nothing when you think about developing a project, you know, a big capital-intense project. So this is a really key thing that is driving the market forward, but we certainly need to see more of it done. One of the things I think is very important for this region and that we really do see is a real catalyst, and also elsewhere as well globally, is we need to actually start to value these lower carbon products and services that CCS can enable. You know, we've named here LNG, you know, hydrogen and ammonia as being a carrier of hydrogen. There are others, you know, lower carbon chemicals, lower carbon cement for like local sector, you know, low carbon steel. They all need to be valued. You know, again, touching on the standards here, you know, there needs to be some form of commonality, both across the product, but also the carbon, to enable a bit more of a level playing field, but also to enable the consumer and the buyer of these goods to have a transparent way of knowing that what it's buying, what it's acquiring, actually is low carbon, and here are the methods and steps that have been taken to ensure that that's the case. So fundamentally, you know, to reach global potential, and, you know, actually for this sector to scale, you know, there needs to be a lot of work between policymakers and organizations. So, you know, there needs to be an acceleration of deployment where incentives already exist. So there's been some mention of the US 45Q today. That's really stimulating the market for direct air capture. It's really stimulating the market for point source CCS. But that's in one country, and in certain locations, it's not enough. So there needs to be a lot of acceleration deployment and kind of value chain development elsewhere. There needs to be an expansion of carbon pricing and financing schemes. By carbon pricing, that's very much on the policy side, but we also need to see financing available for these types of projects. You know, this is a big capital outlay for many organizations, so they need to have long-term contracts, long-term offtake. There needs to be some security brought into the stable environment that's needed for these types of investment. Touching again, it's been mentioned lots today, there needs to be a strong form of collaboration to accelerate the development. You know, we need these shared ecosystems, we need to structure partnerships, joint ventures, there needs to be a lot of risk and revenue sharing across the value chain. And then fundamentally, we do need to create that demand, but also create value for these lower carbon products. And at the moment, many of them are more expensive than the current, you know, emitting alternative. And we do need to make a shift there so that we can get the level of support needed for these for these abated alternatives. Thank you.
So, hi, we're going to go a little more apace. So I want to introduce our last speaker, Kikuko, from Japan. She spent 15 years working on carbon credit generation through multilateral and bilateral schemes, the CDM of the UN and the JCM in Japan. She also has experience in climate finance and supporting low carbon and adaptation business development globally. She supported the CCUS product development in Asian countries through engaging in policy dialogue with government officials and exploring carbon market opportunities, and has supported private companies in developing strategies for CCUS deployment. Before joining Mitsubishi Research Institute, MRI, where she is now, she's worked as a senior consultant in environmental strategy at Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley. She has a degree from UCLA in the US. So without further ado, Kikuko.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be the last speaker of the session today. My name is Kikuko Shinchi, as just introduced. I'm from the Climate Change Solutions Group of the Mitsubishi Research Institute. Mitsubishi Research Institute, or MRI, we are just over 50 years old. We were founded by our brother sister companies of the Mitsubishi Group at the 100th anniversary of the Mitsubishi Group. And, but we are now an independent company listed in Tokyo Exchange. We have over 800 consultants and engaged in advisory and consultancy work. And CCUS, we also have a regional office for the Middle Eastern region in Dubai, and CCUS is a very important topic for MRI. And for CCUS, we have engaged in a variety of work. It started almost 20 years ago in 2005 when MRI has provided methodology, draft methodologies for CDM for CCS projects. And since then, we're engaged in policy making, advising the government of Japan to develop CCS guidelines for JCM. And we are also advising methodology development for CDM and JCM, as I've explained. And we have also engaged in a number of studies on business environment in a variety of countries around the world, including policy development. And we have also supported mainly the private sector companies of Japan to implement feasibility studies and project plans for CCUS. And we have also extensively worked with Asia CCUS Network for knowledge sharing and public outreach. And this slide shows the history of CCUS and crediting schemes. And as this has already been discussed somewhat by Paul, so I'm not going to go into much detail. But I just want to mention that since the days of developing modalities and procedure for CDM, in the early 2000s and the early 2010s, we have shifted towards country or regional programs as represented in the countries like US, Canada, and Australia since the mid-2010s to early 2020s. And so as you can see here that the policy and carbon market are very closely related. And now we're seeing further development of carbon crediting for CCUS in a voluntary market. But this doesn't mean that not every country can engage in country-level programs or take part in voluntary crediting schemes. There is a gap to be filled. And I think joint crediting mechanism it can play the role of filling that gap. Joint crediting mechanism, or JCM for short, was initiated by the government of Japan, and it's regarded as a top runner for Article 6.2 program. And it hasn't yet done so, but JCM intends to include CCS in its sectoral scope. And MRI is actually advising the government of Japan on developing JCM CCS guidelines at the moment. Japan has agreements on JCM with 26 countries. And the concept of JCM is that it's not just about generating carbon credits, but it's about technology transfer and achieving emissions reduction through international and technological collaboration. And the emissions reductions achieved will be measured in accordance with the approved methodology, and the emissions reduction will be shared between the participating countries, and which eventually can be counted towards each country's NDC. And the government of Japan is aware that it's in order to achieve high level of emissions reduction, you cannot just implement one project. And in order to replicate projects, you need enabling policy framework and enabling technologies. So doing JCM projects have involved a lot of policy dialogues with partner countries and a lot of technology capacity development. And for example, Indonesia is one of the important JCM partner countries, and Japan has supported feasibility studies for CCUS in Indonesia for some years now. And through engaging in dialogues with the stakeholders of Indonesia, now Indonesia has a presidential decree on carbon pricing, and now they have a ministerial decree on CCUS, which provides for a much awaited policy framework and for CCUS. And it also has a provision for generating carbon credits through CCUS projects. And now Indonesia is almost ready to implement CCUS carbon credit generating projects. So I think it gives a very good example of how our carbon market can be utilized, not just to help the economics of projects, but also to help to initiate some policy development. This is the overview of the draft JCM guidelines. I'm not going into much detail. I think this has been touched upon by many of my previous speakers. We're discussing on items such as, eligible projects, whether to include CO2 EOR, and if to include it, how to conservatively account for the emissions reduction. The terminology for project termination and monitoring. If you're looking towards CCS hub projects where multiple CO2 sources are connected to a common pipeline or a storage infrastructure, who's going to monitor what for how long? That needs to be looked into. And also, obviously, consideration for CO2 reversal. We're looking into creating a reserve account or buffer. And so these will be incorporated into the JCM CCS guidelines. And last but not least, I would just like you to introduce to some of the activities we're engaged in terms of the carbon credit and enabling policy framework. We just held a workshop this January, and all the information is on the website as in a QR code here. So you're very welcome to have a look. Thank you very much.
I think we have a few minutes for discussion, but I want to wait and hear back from the organizers if we want to go into the 10 minutes of discussion or not, given that it's 5 p.m. now. Is it okay? Okay, we have 10 minutes then for discussion. I have a couple questions to start. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. Honestly, we are full of talent here, as one would say, poorly translated into English from German. I first want to start off with Dr. Zakkour. Given that you gave an overview of markets that have CCS as a part of their NDCs, do you think that it's curious that these markets aren't really a part of the CCM or VCM as of right now? Or is there something, that you'd like to impart about how that might look to change? I don't know how we're going to do this without microphones. We have microphones? Yeah. Yeah.
Is that it? You want me to have a go at addressing that question?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's like, I think what we're forgetting is that the market mechanism of the Paris Agreement is the Article 6. So if countries want to engage in trading between themselves towards NDCs, that's the key phrase in Article 6, is then they need to follow the Article 6 rules. And I think that's why the experiences we had under CDM are so critical, because these kind of already set a de facto flaw in how we can do these projects, or how we should do these projects within a UN accounting framework. So, yeah, the voluntary carbon market. So I think the challenge for the voluntary carbon market then is to think about how closely aligned their standards are with what the CDM was offering back then. Because if they want to be then integrated as a 6.2 crediting mechanism, an Article 6.2 mechanism, as opposed to the 6.4 mechanism, then we can expect that they should be looking to align themselves quite closely with what CDM did. So for example, if you were to do a project here in Qatar involving CCUS, and you wanted to sell those units to Switzerland for its NDC compliance, then I think what we would see there is a need for that to be quite robust set of rules in place for how that project is implemented. And whether it's implemented through a standard set by GCC or Vera or Puro or whoever, I think the same sort of flaw would be there that came from the CDM. So I think that's why it's so important.
Up till now, it's been mostly just domestic NDCs, so it's been within their own borders, and so when crossing the border becomes much more important because it has to be something that's tradable,
so
acknowledged,
for example,
certified.
Yeah, the EU has CCS within its NDC, but it doesn't accept, it's already stated it's not accepting Article 6 credits before 2030, so it's going to be doing CCS within its own borders under the emissions trading scheme, for example. So the crediting systems don't really apply in that context, other than what Europe's trying to do now with carbon removals, which they're trying to launch as a sort of embedded crediting mechanism under a trading system framework, which is always complicated to do, let's be frank. So that's kind of what's going on there, but hopefully that gives a sense of how I think the landscape is evolving a little bit in the market space.
No, thank you for those broad strokes. Does anyone else want to comment? Great.
Probably worth hearing our colleague from Japan, because they're facing these similar
There's
questions.
an open mic for you. Please, Kikuko.
I'm not sure if this answers your questions directly, but if for international trading of carbon credits, there's a mechanism called corresponding adjustment. So, an implementing country, if the credits are transferred to another country, the implementing country needs to cannot claim a certain portion of credits that's claimed by the other country. So to avoid double counting. So I think that's the main difference. But I think whatever each country can claim, it can be counted towards the NDCs.
Yep. Great. I wanted to actually stay with you because I wanted to ask about the JCM and how one could imagine that as being a template about what other countries could do. Have you seen there's be uptake in certain markets? I saw that there are 26 partner countries for partnership with the JCM, but have you seen that being used as a template for what other countries might for a policy-based template in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in North America, elsewhere? And would you also be able to comment on whether, beyond CCUS, whether CDR would also then be, at some point in the future, included?
Yes, as I've mentioned in my presentation, JCM can definitely play a role in initiating some certain policy development, but it cannot be the only JCM that cannot solve all policy issues. So I think it really needs to take place together with other works, such as, for example, this is not CCUS, but in order to introduce like low carbon, high performance appliances, some of the very effective policies in Southeast Asia have been, labeling, or evaluating the performance, and also subsidy. So I think they all need to come together. So carbon, not just carbon market, but carbon market, financial support, and other supports also. So that you need the policy mix, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and CDR, of course, JCM can cover anything that contributes to GHG emissions reduction. So CDR, there's no example or precedence yet, but it's definitely on the horizon.
Okay, but the market will come. I had some more questions for our other speakers, but in the interest of time, we're being asked to cut it short. I guess I'll pose those to you privately. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a round of applause for our great speakers today. And I'll welcome to the stage Mr. Cole.
Well, I think we should have a round of applause for James as well. So, well done, James. Well done. It's a wrap, everybody. We stayed on a little longer because we were late back from the break, but James and a great panel did us proud. Don't forget dinner tonight at 8 o'clock here in the ballroom. So enjoy your sort of quick break and see you a bit later tonight.